Hi everyone and welcome to my updated Heartseeker guide for the rogues in Season 11. This is a build I have played quite a bit already in previous seasons. It is still kind of the same build, but I wanted to give you an updated guide for it with the bunch of changes that have happened in Season 11. This is not really the craziest build out there, but it is pretty fun, fast, smooth, tanky, so it kind of has everything, but it's not like the top tier build or something like that. It just works and I really love playing it. So let's jump into it. So here's my updated planner. I have a few different variants. You can see here the progression, Ancestral, Mythic, and then also Sanctified. That is a bit experimental because you don't really know what will be all the outcomes here on the Sanctification. So I might have to redo this a little bit. But in terms of just like, making the base setup work, we have everything here. We also have the Paragons. There's some step progression here. So for example, starting with 200. And then you can up it here with, where to put the remaining points basically. Before that, you just kind of like go the, board by board number. So, you try to fill this out as it says here, and then this, and so on. Then we also have the skills. So there is not really any like kind of variance or progression here. You kind of start with the final version of the build as you go. Technically, you can level this from level 1 and play Heartseeker. We actually have a leveling guide for Heartseeker on Max Store. But I would recommend you probably want to level something like Dance of Knives, and then maybe switch to Heartseeker once you got a few of the most important pieces online. For basic attack builds in particular, there are actually some pretty important items. In particular, the Pain Gorger's Gauntlet here. This is kind of like the key item for this build to make this especially have a lot of AoE clear. So the way this works is that you mark enemies when you hit them, and then when you hit any of your marked enemies, the damage will spread to all other marked enemies. Since Heartseeker is usually a single target attack, well, it can have like double cast and it can have this ricochet, but realistically it's a single target attack, so you don't really have a lot of clear. And in that case, Paingor just solves that for you. You just need to spread this mark to everything. And how do you do this? Well, there's a pretty funny mechanic, which is the wolves from the save rune. So those actually count as hitting them with another skill. So you can have a bunch of these wolves summoned, usually have something like 6 of them jumping around and cleaving stuff. So they will actually spread this mark really quickly to everything on the screen. And then as soon as you hit any other target, it will basically explode the entire pack. So that's kind of one of the main combos here. So we have those wolves, we have the Pain Gorgers, and that gives you a lot of clear. On top of that, there is another pretty important item, which is the Shard of Raphael. A lot of damage for basic skills. It has the ranks, the attack speed, the resources that helps us to scale, for example, the adaptability aspect. So this is a pretty big package. Kind of tough to get a good roll, unfortunately, because there's this massive range. But as soon as you have any Shard of Raphael, it's already a pretty good upgrade. And now your Heartseeker will cost resources. So this is another kind of important thing to solve here, which is how much resource generation do you have. So your basic attacks on the rogue usually don't generate any energy. So the only way to do this is through lucky hit effects or just passive regeneration. So passively you get like 8 energy per second, but it's not really enough to fuel this 25 cost. The cost will actually be a bit lower because you also have the resourcefulness of elixir, so that's like minus 20%. So it will actually cost 20, and later you also have the Starter Skies, so it is halved again, so it actually only costs 10. So it's relatively easy to keep it up, but we want to go further than that. We also have the Quax rune here. So you see here we have Ahu and Quax in our bow. So like this, you get a pretty strong damage buff pretty much all the time. So you can roughly double your damage with this as long as you keep this up. It has a 1 second cooldown, 1 second duration, and you have pretty good lucky hits in order to trigger this all the time as well, as soon as targets reach below 80% health. So on boss fights, it's not active at the start, but after that, it's basically just proccing over and over and over. But obviously, it drains all of your energy and you need to get a lot of energy back. So you see this on our weapon here, for example, we have the lucky hit, 50% chance to restore primary resource. And in the, for example, previous variants, we also put this on our one-handed weapon. Later on, you actually have enough lucky hits that you don't really need this, and you can swap out one of these rolls here, put something else there. But if you feel like it's a bit tight with the resources sometimes, you can keep it there. It's not a huge loss. And the other source here is the innovation passive. So this is just kind of like a rogue staple. You put a few points in there, and those two lucky hit procs are actually separate from each other. They can proc independently. so you have pretty good resource recovery. So as you shoot, you will get your resources back pretty easily, but then you also have the Ahu Quacks combo that drains the resources really fast, but you get it back even faster thanks to those lucky hits. You need a lot of lucky hits to trigger this here with the Ahu combo. So you will generally always refill it before the Quacks triggers again. And there are a few other upsides to this as well. So not only do you get a huge damage buff, but you also get preparation procs. So this is our class specialization here. Every time you spend 75 energy, you reset your ultimate cooldown, and then that gives you a damage reduction buff and resets all of your other skills. So you can effectively press your Shadow Clone every few seconds. You will have near permanent uptime on this Unstoppable buff. You have a fresh Shadow Clone all the time that gives you this extra damage output. He actually does probably even more damage than your own attacks. So the Shadow Clone is hitting like a truck, and you have him permanently out. This guy can also then trigger more lucky hits, and it just kind of helps you across the board with everything. So you can see that despite Heartseeker being like this very basic one single arrow that you shoot, suddenly you have the Pain Gorges for the AoE, you have the Shadow Clone hitting stuff, and then that spreads to the AoE, to everything as well. And you also have, you know, just pretty decent single target output. So this is why you have such a nice kind of, you know, both single target capability and AoE capability at once, thanks to this item and just how the build works. Let's talk about the rest of the gear a little bit. So after you get the Pain Gorges and maybe the Shard, but I think you should really have the Pain Gorges at least to get started. Then you also have a bunch of other uniques. So mostly we have Penitent Greaves, which is like a nice little like damage upgrade on your boots, but it's not really crucial, I would say. So this is like optional. But then we have Shroud and Perdition here, so they are pretty good, huge damage boosts. You want to try to work towards those mythics here. And then also the Starless Skies. This just makes it more smooth with your resources. Generally, you should not have a resource issue because of what I just described. But it can happen that maybe sometimes you shoot into the wall and you don't actually hit anything. And then you might have to wait like, you know, 1 or 2 seconds to actually get energy to recover it. If you have Starless Skies, then this is just smoothed out because this waiting time can be reduced in that case, for example. Before that, we just kind of fill it up with more legendaries and also the Card of the Nameless. This is a pretty good starter item as well. So if you don't have your Mythic Helm yet, Card of the Nameless is pretty good. It has huge passives here and is nice like a hit bonus as well. So this just helps you out. And then for Sanctification, we'll see. But there's a lot of like pretty good aspects you can throw into some of those slots here, and you can like move some aspects around if they are all available. So I'm not 100% sure yet if that is going to happen. So we'll see. But realistically, you can get some pretty huge upgrades once you start sanctifying your gear with the season theme in season 11. So we'll see, and you know how many of those like, you know, double ups you can get on the aspects here, or even put aspects on some of your unique items or something like that. But speaking of aspects, there are a few important ones. Adaptability, I've mentioned already, this is a huge damage buff because we have a bit of extra maximum energy. So you see here, our setup here is actually at 153%. Most of it comes from the elixir and the shard. So you have a pretty big upgrade. Then we have the cold clip here. This works with any target, even against bosses. So you don't even have to stagger them to get this extra 40% damage buff, but also you get the cold imbuement. So that's kind of like a pretty huge thing. You see we have the cold imbuement spec here. This gives you a 20% damage buff or 40% against frozen. Generally, you freeze everything instantly. You also have the wolves for you that freeze everything. So you get this, and you get the cold clip buff on top. And it's basically always active, so that's really nice. And then we have Very Man Brawler, kind of minor, but yeah, helpful with the Shadow Clone. And Moonrise here, pretty strong aspect. You put it on the two-handed weapon. One note I want to do here is the Umbrus aspect. So this gives you 3 Dark Shrouds every time you attack. You don't have to press it, you don't have to time it. But you need to have maybe these points invested here. They are pretty good. You can get 10 crit here, for example. You can also get healing if you really want. You get the movement speed. So it's a pretty nice package. And if you feel a bit squishy, then you can also put more points into Dark Shroud, for example. But I made the setup somewhat tanky, and you also crowd control everything, and you're at range. So generally, you should not really have any survivability issues, I think. Now let's talk about the stats a little bit. We have Heartseeker ranks, of course. You want to get those, or any kind of basic skill ranks that you can get, for example, from the Shard of Arathiel and the Pain Gorges. So this is your main attack. Then we have the Tempers. Chance for clone to deal double damage. You want to try to hit 100% of that. You can now get greater affix tempers, so it's actually pretty easy with just the weapon here. And then we can still put some chance for Heartseeker projectiles to cast twice. This one is not as important as the Shadow Clone. You might be wondering why. while this also applies to the Shadow Clone with the cast twice. The cast twice does not work for the Pain Gorgers. So it is nice extra damage, especially on single target, but most of the AoE clear comes from this unique and only the first shot. So the cast twice doesn't really help you with that, unfortunately. So this is why this has a lower priority, even though, you know, it actually also buffs the clone. And then for our offensive tempers, we have the damage per Dark Shroud Shadow. You can get a lot of additive damage here. So you have 5 of them usually at all times. So you get something like 350% or something from each of those tempers here, or like 250 in this case. It's a lot of damage. So you want to try to have that. And if you are really struggling with your Shadow Clone uptime, which normally you shouldn't, then you can also put a Shadow Clone cooldown temper. But usually with the preparation and the Quax procs, you're going to have an easy time resetting. And lastly, Caltrops duration. So I have this here on the pants. There used to be second wind tempers. That is now gone. So they deleted that. So you don't have that much barrier generation anymore. But you can still invest into this passive and get a 60% barrier, which is really good anyway. And it's basically triggers every few seconds. So you are always protected. And now we have Caltrops duration. So Caltrops duration just helps you, especially on bosses. Like you don't really use it in like farming or something like that. But you throw them on the boss, you try to keep it rolling, and with this Caltrops duration temper you can keep this 45% damage buff up basically all the time, and it has a 12 seconds duration, so it's very easy. Yeah, for everything else you can check out the skill tree here. It's mostly just picking up a lot of these damage passives. Rogue has a lot of them, so you want to, you know, try to get all of them. And yeah, one thing that's kind of like worth noting is Deadeye is a very strong passive, and that is actually available for this build. You want to be distant, which is not a very large distance, so it's roughly the size of like a waypoint, roughly, you know, when you look at the circle of the waypoint. So it's very easy to be at distance, but you want to do that at all times because it is passive here. Besides that, I did mention like Innovation and Second Wind. They are pretty important. We also have a bunch of like really strong offensive passives here, like Unto Dawn. You definitely want to invest in that as soon as possible. This is for your Shadow Clone, which does most of the damage. And we also have some other nice stuff like Impetus, for example, that you can use here. So after you use your ultimate, then you want to move a little bit and you can get this bonus online until the next time you cast your Shadow Clone, for example. So you can try to proc this in like a boss fight where maybe you dash to the other side and then you trigger this. And besides that, yeah, most is just pretty much auto-activated, like some extra damage buffs. You have the smoke grenade here, you can throw this on elites and on the bosses, for example, and the rest is pretty straightforward, movement and shoot. And a final note about the skill tree. So my choice for the key passive here is Close Quarters Combat, which is definitely the strongest choice you can make, but it does require a little bit of attention. So here you get an 8-second buff for using either a marksman or cutthroat skills on close enemies. So this means that you have to use sometimes your dash or your shadow step in order to trigger the cutthroat portion of this. Actually, the Shadow Clone might also be able to trigger it sometimes. But more importantly, you also have to go close to use a marksman skill sometimes. So effectively what you want to do is a Shadow Step in, this triggers the cutthroat, and then shoot once, and that triggers the marksman, and then you have an 8-second buff that gives you a lot of attack speed and a lot of damage. Now this can feel somewhat clunky. I guess it definitely sounds pretty bad. Personally, I've never really had issues keeping this up. It's just something to remember in boss fights, for example, where you actually have like a long fight sometimes and you might just stand there and shoot. Then sometimes you still have to press your shadow step, for example. But besides that, it kind of happens naturally as you play, you know, dash from pack to pack, and something always like runs up to you and is in close range anyway, so you don't really have to think about it. However, if you really don't like playing with this, you can go with Victimize. So Victimize is kind of like the comfy version of this. It is definitely a downgrade in terms of damage. I would say you lose maybe like a third or so of your overall output. And you also have the downside that you first have to proc the Victimize explosion to then get this Victimize 75% damage buff. But you can do that if you really don't want to think about this at all, or maybe you want to swap your skills around a little bit and you don't like playing with Shadow Step and these kind of things, then this is also an option. But if you play with close quarters, as I have here in my guide, then just remember that you have to cycle your Shadow Step like roughly every 8 seconds or so. And you also have to hit something from close range with your Heartseeker once every 8 seconds. And lastly, here we have the Paragons. So as I mentioned, you just kind of go through the order of the boards and assign all the points. There's nothing really crazy special about this here. It's mostly just damage buffs. So you have a bunch of like, you know, just raw DPS upgrades. One thing here worth noting is no witnesses. You want to make sure that this has the 60% maximum bonus. This is very important. So usually you just get this from the board itself. There is these ultimate damage nodes here. You can buff those. There's also ultimate damage here. And this usually gives you enough already to cap this. Then we have Eldritch Bounty. This is just the raw damage upgrade as well. Really nice. Gives you a bunch of defense. And lastly, Cheap Shot. So again, worth noting that this is a build that relies on cold imbuement and crowd control damage a little bit. So while, for example, the cold clip aspect works against bosses, like some of these other effects do not. And you will definitely notice that when you have a staggered boss, you'll do a lot more damage than a non-staggered boss. Or likewise with elites. This is like a typical rogue thing. When elites become unstoppable, you do lose a lot less damage. So you lose probably like half or even 2/3 or so until you can CC them again. Just something to keep in mind. And that's it for the Heartseeker rogue. So I hope you enjoyed this guide. I wish you good luck in Season 11. Personally, I'm definitely going to make this later in the season or so because I just really like Heartseeker. So here's my guide. Like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.